funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
When the famine struck,
Catholic and Protestant clergymen
were absolutely essential to the relief programme.
And not only gave their charity, but in some instances gave their lives.
Death was walking up to the doors of the priest, and they were going into houses where nobody else would visit.
They risked their lives to go into some of the poorest communities during the famine.
And here we see great acts of charity.
The great sacrifices made by Catholic priests, by Protestant ministers.
Fighting the fight for charity, and many died.
5 parish priests alone in Galway died.
The priest did die.
And about 6 or 7 nuns in Kerry also contracted famine fever and died.
So they laid their lives on the line.
They just practiced what they preached.
Relief before ritual.
I'm Paul Wright and welcome to the second programme of Forgotten Famine Heroes. In our last programme we investigated the work of various clergy, Catholic and Protestant, in trying to relieve distress and save lives during the Great Irish Famine from 1845 to 1850. Now, continuing with that investigation, here is Dr. Kieran O'Reilly, Maynooth University historian and author of the book John Plunkett Joly and the Great Famine in Kings County, to divulge the story of the Protestant minister, Reverend Joly.
The Reverend Henry Joly in the parish of Bracknell in County Offaly is interesting. Joly combines with the local Catholic priest, the Reverend Dunn, to oversee and implement the overseeing of relief throughout the famine. And although the Joly family continue to live the life of the big house and so forth, the efforts that they go to in providing relief in 1846 and 1847, in conjunction with the Catholic priests of the area, is noteworthy. And also the fact that they set up at their own expense a dispensary where they provide medicine and treatment for people who have succumbed to fever and illness. And remember, in the latter part of the famine, 1848-49, a lot of the death is actually caused by cholera and typhus and so forth. And so the efforts of Reverend Joly and his family are crucial in stemming the death in that part of the country. His efforts continue as late as 1853. We know from the diaries of his son, who succeeded him as rector of Clonsast, John Plunkett Joly, that in early 1853 he decided, now that cholera and typhus had ceased and passed, to close up the dispensary and to bring, he brings the medicines home with him back to his own house. So as late as 1853, the Jolys are providing relief for a large proportion of people in Clonsast, and this is an area which is very boggy. There's no towns, so it would have been difficult to get to the people to actually give them medicine and help them when they had succumbed to fever.
And as well as the likes of the Protestant Reverend Joly in County Offaly, many Catholic clergy also worked hard to try relieve famine distress. County Donegal historian Sean Beattie.
Well, the Catholic priests themselves, a huge number of them were very, very active in relief throughout Donegal, right through the famine. They're sort of the forgotten link. They're written out of it, or they're written off. Certainly not talked about, but I would feel very, very strongly that they were central, and in many cases the direction not only didn't come just from the Vatican, it came through the local bishop, and right through the famine, the various bishops in Donegal were, not just Bishop McGinn but his successors, were active in promoting relief and encouraging sanitation and improving conditions and bringing in relief schemes for potatoes and assisting the really poor, getting relief tickets for the workhouse. So in 1001 ways, this unwritten history of the role of the Catholic Church in relief is one that should be highlighted.
I suppose one of the most important things that they did really was acting as witnesses to the devastation, and they did this in a very active way by writing to newspapers, writing letters to possibly local notables, local elites, as well as national and maybe international organisations as well.
Historian Georgina Larry of Queen's University, Belfast.
So you have numerous letters from priests and religious recorded and reported in national and local newspapers as well. And I suppose at the time it should also be acknowledged that they were probably one of the few sections of society who were literate in Ireland at the time. So literacy increases dramatically in the post-famine period because there had been the introduction of the National Education Act prior to that. But priests and clergymen were really very well educated, and in terms of getting the information out there, they would have been one of the best local correspondents that you could have, because in seeking relief, local Irish people did at the time go to their local priest, who they felt had access and knowledge to somebody more powerful than they would have been.
And one such local priest who wrote innumerable memorials and letters seeking help for his community was Father Eugene McCarthy of Ballyhaig in County Kerry. North Kerry historian Brian McMahon.
The human side of individual priests comes across very strongly, and there was another priest in Ballyhaig, a man called Eugene McCarthy, Owen McCarthy, and what I have found for him is that he was a great help in drafting these memorials, as they call them, to the Lord Lieutenant, spelling out the situation and appealing very respectfully and very formally and very humbly for a bit of help for his people. And he was describing the kind of destitution, saying that out of a parish of 15,000 people, 15,000 souls, 6,000 were in absolute destitution. And it was interesting to see that government officials would kind of have a covering letter going with these appeals, and they might say, well, Father McCarthy might exaggerate somewhat, but nevertheless the distress is very extreme in this area. So they didn't undermine him and say he was overstating it or anything like that. They kind of agreed with him, and I found that interesting.
Brian, were his letters answered? Did it become dead letters, so to speak, or were they actually? Was there some kind of official response to these letters, and was there rectification of a horrific situation on the ground?
They were answered, but there was a kind of a standard letter, because to be honest with you, I think the Lord Lieutenant and all the officials were getting exactly the same letters from every little parish in the west of Ireland. You know, he was only one of many. They were pouring into the authorities, and there was a kind of a standard letter going back to them saying they'd be doing their best, or it would be looked into, or officials would be in touch. That was the typical thing, but there was nothing dramatic from that. Their letters would be noted and acknowledged, I suppose. That's as much as you could say. Another man, Father McCarthy in Tarbert, Ballylongford area, the same name. This man, he encountered hordes of people on the roads. That's what they would do. Hundreds of people would kind of walk to his house, and when they saw these crowds walking on the roads, a lot of landlords and others took fright. They were afraid that this was a kind of an eruption of violence, but in fact they were quite peaceable, and they were turning up at local magistrates' houses, local landlords' houses, and the parish priest's house, simply to appeal for work or appeal for something for their suffering families. And on one occasion, this Father McCarthy in Ballylongford said, "On Wednesday last, in the discharge of my duty, I met some hundreds of people from the western portions of this parish. After a long remonstrance with them, the poor people retired, hoping for some immediate relief." And then he adds very poignantly 3 little sentences which have struck me forcibly. "The people looked to me. I have nothing in my power. All I could do, I did." And that kind of sums it up for me. It's as stark as that. He was helpless. "I have done all I could do," he said. "I have nothing more in my power." So his own kind of personal sense of despair comes across from that. And that was common as well.
And another Catholic priest who was similarly overwhelmed by the famine crisis engulfing his parish was Father Kavanagh in Galway City. Willie Henry, Galway City historian and author of the book Famine, Galway's Darkest Years.
We're a port. Galway is a port. But what we've got to remember, and this was what's kind of horrifying for me to think, was that in 1849, in March of 1849, a priest by the name of Father Kavanagh of the St. Nicholas parish here was sent to Bohermore on a number of sick calls. Now, he had visited a number of houses that particular week, but he recorded the last day he was in Bohermore of that particular week. Now, we've got to remember Bohermore is a very small parish, and they were losing something like 5 people a day to the famine-related diseases and the famine itself. And something like 5,000 had died in a short period of time in 1847. But by 1849, as most indications in the UK would say at the time the famine was over in 1845, it was anything but, you know. So he recorded that he went to the first house and he walked in. The door was left ajar. The roof, there was a hole in it, and it was a wet, dirty morning. It was dark inside, and he could hear the drop, like water almost flowing. And it was raining, like when he was on his visit, and there was a hole in the roof, and there was a huge pool of water, and it was falling. The rain was still falling into that, and he shouted to see was there anybody there. It was a Devaney family he was going to visit, and this lady of about 30 years of age, dressed in filthy undergarment, came out from the inner room, and then she had a baby that started to wail, and she started to cry to the priest for help and support. And he said, "I'm here to visit Mr. Devaney. Is he here?" And she said, "He is, but I am starving. We haven't eaten in 3 days." So as he spoke, the daughter came in. She was out, and she had a candle, half a candle. She'd gone out to beg for a candle. And she brought the priest to the inner room, and she lit it. And there he said, in the corner, one in each corner, was her father and mother, still alive, but in the throes of death. And he said this man, some months earlier, had been a successful tradesman. So he was shocked at that. So he moved on to the next house, which was Caulfield's. And he found in that house, he walked in, and there was a woman lying on a bed of straw, and he wasn't sure whether she was dead or alive. And he saw this young girl, and she was shivering and crying, sitting on a bench. And half a bench, it was a short bench. It had been cut in half seemingly. Some of it was used for firewood. And her sister was holding her arms. And there was one man sitting at the fire, stirring one piece of coal in the fire, trying to keep it alight, to keep the place warm. And his son came in, and his son had 3 cabbage leaves. And this is all these people had to eat in 3 days. And then he moved on. He went to another house. But the last house he went to was a man by the name of Dowd. And he said he never witnessed the misery he had seen throughout all of his years involved in the famine. This overcame everything he had ever witnessed. And he said it sufficed to record, he said, that he died that night in the depth of the coldness and the darkness and was buried without a marker. And he said the sad part was, never was our port fuller of grain, all for export.
When the famine came to Ireland, many clergy mobilized to help the poor and tend the sick. Untold numbers gave their lives, victims of a fever, an evil curse that spread with a vengeance through the country, to leave 1 million dead. Father Kavanagh in Galway called to the sick each day. Parishioners he knew and loved, withered, died away.
And Father Kavanagh, he did the best. He tried to distribute whatever he had. And when he was called out initially, he was called out to give the last rites. So he wouldn't have been he didn't have a lot of food to distribute himself anyway. But he was called out to give the last rites. But what he did do, he reported it to the bishop and the authorities. He wrote a number of letters to the government, and he wrote to the bishop, and he wanted this addressed immediately. And he was well aware that other areas were suffering also. But as far as he was concerned, he needed this taken care of urgently. Father Kavanagh, that man did his utmost. And I think his diary is very clear what he was really upset when he wrote those words, never, when he said. was our port so full of grain, all for export. He was so annoyed at that, but his hands were tied. You know, like there was commerce involved in this. They wouldn't bring down the price of grain in Ireland because it would interfere with the grain in England. It's right across, you know, it's the spectrum up there that it crossed territories. So you have this perception that of the clergy and other people not getting involved in this. Of course they did. Of course they did. They did their utmost that they could. But remember, their hands were tied to a certain extent. There was only so much they could do. This was trying to stem the flow of an amputated leg with a small sticking plaster. You know, it was just ridiculous. When you work it out like that, the relief was so minute coming from government sources that they were left to their own devices to a certain extent. And they managed as best they could, but they certainly didn't ignore it.
I would like to mention as well the curates, because these were the men I've mentioned were all parish priests and men of prominence and authority, but there was the young curates were far more direct, you know, less deferential to authorities and more fired up about the whole situation.
North Kerry historian Brian McMahon.
And one of them was a man called Edward O'Flaherty, and it was Christmas 1847 when he came out on the altar in Ballyduff, and he said to the people in agitation, he said, "I don't think I can say Mass this morning. I'm just so upset and distressed." He said, "I can't come up on the altar." And he explained the reason why. He said, "There are landlords here responsible for the deaths of people." And he started pointing out their agents in the audience. He said, "Some of them are here in the audience, or in the congregation, I should say." And he named them. And at that stage, the wife and daughters of one of the men that he named and denounced from the altar got up and left the church because she was in fear for her own safety. So the whole incident became a major issue, and young Father O'Flaherty was called the political Hotspur of Kerry curates, this clerical disturber of the peace and so on, because he had overstepped the mark. And by that stage, landlords had been killed, you know, like the man in Strokestown, you know, having been denounced from the altar. So they were up in arms about this denunciation from the altar, and they complained to the bishop, and they wrote to the authorities to see if he could be sanctioned for incitement of violence and so on. And they got a reply from the bishop saying that he would move the priest to another parish, which I presume is what he did. But you can see, like, his patience had run out really, and he became personalised, I suppose, in his attacks on local landlords and their agents. Another young curate, his name comes up as somebody who was called to the assistance of a young mother and child who were in a laneway in Tralee, and a short newspaper account says Father Thomas Enright came to their aid and secured some accommodation for them. And then about 4 months later, another short news item saying the same man, Father Thomas Enright, had died of famine fever. And he was one of about 6 or 7 or 8 possibly in the county of Kerry who died during that famine period.
Yes, when the famine came to Ireland, many clergy mobilised to help the poor and tend the sick. Untold numbers gave their lives.
It's important to stress that throughout the Great Famine from 1845 to 1850, many female religious were also in the front lines of trying to help alleviate poverty and hunger. Peadar O'Dowd, Galway historian and author of the book The Great Famine and the West.
Lots of things happened, of course, during the famine here. One of the big things, of course, was our population was hit very badly because of the famine and so on. But there were a lot of great people came to the fore here. One of them was a Sister of Mercy. Now, this Sister of Mercy, her name was initially, obviously, Christina Joyce. And she was daughter of Walter Joyce, one of the first bankers, if not the first banker in Galway. They were the descendants of the famous Joyce family of Galway, one of the tribes of Galway. And they had their big house, if you like to call it that, in Merview. It's called Tara Hall, which later is still there and became the China factory here in Galway. Now, obviously she grew up in wealth, opulence, you name it. And they were going on a trip when, in the meantime, our first bishop, who was the Bishop Brown as well, he saw poverty, real poverty, all around the city. And he heard about the Sisters of Mercy, and he decided to get them here. So the only man who get them here was the famous or infamous Father Peter Daly. So Father Peter Daly went over to Macaulay and so on and made sure that they came here. And they came here in 1840. And would you believe that the first postulant in the door was Christina Joyce, the daughter of this landlord, if you like. And she forwent her trip to Europe and became a postulant. She was professed in 1842 as Sister Mary Joseph Joyce. And another young lady by the name of Burke from Our in South County Mayo, she actually died after only a few weeks. So her dowry, and now we have to be careful on the dowries, but I think the dowry had to be paid something like £400 to get in to the nuns at the time, which was a hell of a lot of money. So what happened was that her dowry was switched to some other girl. Her name was Frances MacDonald. So Frances MacDonald and Christina Joyce were professed, and just, of course, in time, if you like to call it that, for the famine. The Great Famine broke out, as we know, in 1845, 1846, 1847, and so on. And the Sisters of Mercy were to the fore, especially when cholera broke out in 1849 here. Now, the first case was actually around here somewhere in Bohermore, first case of cholera.
Bohermore here, situated in Galway City.
And within 2 months, 611 people had died in that 6 weeks period. And, well, obviously we had a fever hospital which was overrun, and they had to open auxiliary fever hospitals. But right in the thick of all that was Christina Joyce. And not alone did she serve the people there, but she also came to all the places where the cholera was. And sadly, she picked up the cholera herself and died. So the strange thing about all of that was she died in St. Vincent's, which was their house, just beside the Samware Bridge. And because there was such a fear that she died in the upstairs section of the convent. And the Reverend Mother at the time says, no, she cannot be brought down the normal way through the stairs because of contagion possibilities. So she had to be lowered, her coffin had to be lowered by a rope from the third story up, so that into a cart and immediately brought away. And some of the priests actually at the time thought her to be a saint, and that they were quite willing to carry the coffin. But no, the Reverend Mother wouldn't let it. So after only 5 years, and being very, very young, and not exactly, I'd say she'd be only coming up to her 30s at the most, she was dead. So here's an example of, you don't hear that, but here is an example of a great person. And in her own time, a lot of the priests thought her to be a saint. And unfortunately, she died.
And what exact year did she die?
1849.
1849. So 4 years into the famine, she's in the front line, so to speak.
She's in the front line of feeding the people, but also when cholera broke out in April 1849, she actually administered them and was dead within 2 months of it as such. So she was a great person. Now, there was another nun by the name of Sister Mary Agnes Smith also died of the disease. So 2 nuns in the space of whatever died administrating. So they were actually carrying out what they were professed for, mercy.
Sisters of Mercy also came to nurse the sick and poor. Christina Joyce paid the price when cholera walked her floor. Of the many thousands, she was one to die of that sad curse. With love she made that sacrifice. Mercy has spoken verse.
Well, the nuns in Listowel in particular, these are the presentation nuns, they began with 13 children, giving them food, and soon they were feeding 250 children.
Historian Brian McMahon.
Every morning they gave the children bread, a mug of boiled rice, and a little milk. It was hoped that the diet would prevent dysentery. That was the main objective of it. So during 1847 alone, the nuns in Listowel distributed 31,000 breakfasts to their kids. Nowadays we have breakfast clubs in schools and things like that, and that's what it was, just to ensure that they had at least one sound meal to start the day. I have no doubt that was critical to the children to keep them as well nourished as they could be in the circumstances. I've no doubt that it saved lives. It had to. And as we were saying about the priest dying of the famine, about 6 or 7 nuns in Kerry also contracted famine fever and died as a result of their contact with people.
All over the bleak country, many priests and nuns were there, working on the front line without a selfish care. Untold numbers gave their own lives in answering the call when fever and cholera harvested them all.
In Dingle, again, the nuns rallied to help the starving. They turned their school into part hospital, part cookshop. Day after day, they strove to alleviate the suffering they saw around them. Some of the nuns spent all day baking bread and distributing hot soup to the famished creatures who had hardly enough strength left to hold the vessels in which they received it. That's from the Annals. And this is from the writings of Father Kieran O'Shea. Others dispensed medicines for the relief of fever-stricken victims. Some made clothes for the poor, while others wrote letters appealing for help. Mother Teresa Collins wrote to Rome and received help from Cardinal Franconi on behalf of the Pope. The nuns in Listowel made appeals, and they also received money from the Pope.
And to hear more inspirational stories of grace, then make sure to catch our next and last number 3 programme in this 3-part Forgotten Famine Heroes series.
Great famine broke out, as we know, in 1845, and the Sisters of Mercy were to the fore.
Various convents throughout Ireland, they would be feeding mostly the school children or children every day.
The good nuns were feeding the people.
Some of the nuns themselves contracted famine fever and died.
Of course, in serving their vocation, in manifesting their faith, also really in what can only be described as a heroic fashion, laying down their lives to care for people who are in an absolutely desperate situation.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.